The mass slaughter of the American bison by European settlers was both an ecological and cultural disaster. This is one of the most tragic stories in human history. At one time, there were over 60 million bison that roamed throughout North America. The bison herds roamed throughout what is called Canadian territory all the way down to northern Mexico. There were even bison once found in Washington, D.C. For many indigenous tribes, the bison was a symbol of abundance and harmony. Tribes like the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and dozens more utilized the bison for just about everything. These tribes made sure that nothing went to waste. The bison meat provided a high-protein diet. The meat would be dried and turned into jerky, and in some cases it would be mixed with tallow and berries and turned into what is called pemmican. The bison hides were used for teepees, for clothing, and for bedding. The bladder was used to carry water. Muscle fiber was used to make sinew, which was used to make their bowstrings, and used in sewing porcupine quills and their clothing. And because there were no trees on the Great Plains, even the dung was utilized for fire. Because the bison was so important for their survival, it was incorporated into their forms of spirituality. Buffalo skulls would be utilized in several of their ceremonies, including the sacred Sundance. This was a sacred relationship between human beings and the bison. This really interesting quote by John Lame Deer says it all. The buffalo was part of us, his flesh and blood being absorbed by us until it became our own flesh and blood. Our clothing, our teepees, everything we needed for life came from the buffalo's body. It was hard to say where the animals ended and the humans began. Critical to the survival of several tribes, the bison didn't just provide food and shelter and clothing. It provided a model for a way of life. The bison was a reminder to be good caretakers and stewards of the land. Even the act of hunting was seen as a sacred act. Through song, dance, and prayer, the bison was honored and respected. But of course, everything changes when European settlers arrive. The Great Plains and all the surrounding areas become flooded with European settlers, and this begins a conflict that lasts about 100 years. These settlers and American politicians understood that the bison meant everything for the survival of these tribes. By eradicating the bison, many felt that this would force the tribes of the Great Plains to surrender and live life out on a reservation. The outright slaughter of the bison was not official U.S. policy, but people understood that if you got rid of the bison, that you would eventually get rid of these tribes who many European settlers felt were in the way of progress. This is manifest destiny and settler colonialism in action. The slaughter of the bison was gruesome. From the beginning of the 1800s to the beginning of the 19th century, again, millions of bison are killed. Bison hunters armed with 50 caliber rifles and the skinners who followed them left the plains with millions of bison carcasses to rot. In most cases, this was for profit, but in others, it was simply for sport. People would come from all over to kill bison, including St. George Gore. This wealthy Irishman went on a 3-year reign of terror. Gore and his entourage turned the West into a graveyard. Up to 4,000 bison, 1,500 elk, 2,000 deer, 1,500 antelope, some 500 bears, and hundreds of smaller animals and birds fell to their guns. Each carcass a testament to the plunder, each number a blow to the indigenous people who revered and relied on these creatures for their very survival. And this was all done in the name of sport. The stench was so strong that it could be smelled from miles away. And of course, the bison was turned into a commodity and became an integral part of the growth of American capitalism. Towns such as Dodge City were transformed into industrial centers for the slaughter, with people often shooting bison from railroad cars for mere amusement. Yet it was predominantly the bison hunters and skinners who undertook the bulk of this grim task, annihilating between 5,000 to 100,000 bison per day. These hunters would kill the bison, take the hide, and leave the carcass to rot. The Great Plains literally became a graveyard for millions upon millions of bison. This slaughter is all taking place on native land. So of course the tribes attempt to stop the extermination of the buffalo. In a notable resistance, Comanche leader Quanah Parker, alongside Kiowa and Cheyenne allies, made a valiant effort to halt the bison killing industry during the second battle at Adobe Walls. But the killing spree simply doesn't stop. The bison are dwindled down to less than 500. The consequences are devastating to the tribes of the Great Plains. Without the bison, these indigenous nations face starvation, poverty, and the loss of their cultural foundation. When all the bison were killed and there was nothing left to hunt, all the tribes that resisted were forced onto the reservation. Today, about 500,000 bison are alive here in North America. Presently, bison restoration initiatives are underway across Indian country. And Native Americans are a major reason why the bison was able to survive. Since the 1990s, the Intertribal Buffalo Council has been instrumental in reviving buffalo herds and, by extension, tribal communities across North America. This movement seeks to rejuvenate indigenous lifeways, healing both the land and the people. It's a really inspirational story. We have to ask ourselves this question: what does the slaughter of the bison say about Western European settler colonialism? That people would come here and slaughter millions upon millions of animals. It certainly does say something about the ugliness of Western society and capitalism. I hope you got something from this video, and if you did, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and of course, let me know your thoughts in the comment section.